So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Michael David Fox, who is a professor of history and director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University. Professor David Fox is one of the most distinguished historians of modern Russia and the Soviet Union. His scholarship spans the political and cultural history of the Russian Empire and the USSR. He has written about the Russian Revolution, Stalinism, communism, and fascism, and most recently, the entangled histories of the Eastern Front in World War II. Early in his career, he was among the first foreign researchers to gain access to the formerly closed Soviet archives. He then went on to co-found the journal Kritika, Explorations in Russian and Eurasian History, which transformed and helped internationalize the field. And since then, he's authored a series of field-defining books, including this most recent one, called Crucibles of Power, Smolensk under Stalinist and Nazi Rule, which came out with Harvard University Press. The book returns to the Smolensk region with new sources and new questions. In the book, Professor David Fox examines how residents of Smolensk navigated the passage from Stalinist rule to Nazi occupation and back again, tracing choices that people made under dueling totalitarian regimes and showing what those choices reveal about power, collaboration, and survival. Today's talk is hosted by the Repi Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies, which is part of the Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies, and also co-sponsored by the Department of History and the Jewish Studies Program. So please join me in welcoming Professor David Fox.
First of all, thank you to Professor Christina Floria for that very generous introduction and for the invitation to come here. I'm very happy to talk to you, and I understand that some of the students may have read parts of all of the books, so I'm very happy to leave a chunk of time at the end of this for question and answer. So I'm going to really try to keep my remarks to about 35, maximum 40 minutes, and we have an hour and 15 minutes for this, so there'll be plenty of time for questions. I'm going to start with a couple of maps, not necessarily because geography is destiny, although space and territory and power were important topics in my book, especially as it related to the Stalin period and to, of course, World War II on the Eastern Front. But it's also the case that not everyone knows where Smolensk is. A lot of people, and this is true even when I gave this talk at Harvard last week, where the Smolensk Archive, the captured papers, were actually housed, and the famous Sovietologist Merle Fein-Saw taught, and Harvard, you think they know where Smolensk is, but I told them, you don't know where Smolensk is. You might know where the city of Smolensk is here. But what my book is about is the Smolensk region. And what this map shows is that the interwar period of Soviet history, the 1920s and the 1930s, witnessed the most radical territorial changes in the Smolensk region in its entire history. And it was founded as a gubernia or a province in, I think, the early 19th century. So what you basically, and of course, the city itself goes back to early modern times. There was sort of a borderland garrison in Poland, Lithuania, and Muscovy. But what you see is the darkest part of this map is essentially what the Smolensk region looks like today and has looked like since the post-44 period. It's basically the westernmost region of today's Russian Federation. It's smaller than the much larger regions that this map shows, but it's not small. This is roughly, but in terms of square kilometers, roughly twice the size of Belgium, the smallest, darkest part of the map. I was giving a talk in Seoul, and I told them it's half the size of South Korea. So in terms of square kilometers. However, the population was sparse. It was a largely rural region. Levels of urbanization were comparatively lower than many other parts of the Russian Soviet Federative Republic. So 10–15% urban in towns and cities, and the rest rural. And this, you see the slightly lighter areas around it. This is what basically I was studying with, always with the capital in Smolensk. I was studying this, this is basically what it was looked like in the 1920s up to 1929. And again, after 1937, so in the run-up to World War II. So this Smolensk region is what I was mostly concentrating my attention to. And this was overturned in 1929 with the creation of this entire region, this giant Western region, which had a population. So the smaller region had a population of about 2.3 million, and this larger giant Western Oblast over 6 million. And this was created in 1929 and it was dissolved in 1937. I worked with a great historical cartographer for this book, and she created this map. And interestingly enough, there were almost no extant maps of the 1930s Western Oblast, which was around for only 8 years during the Stalin Revolution. There was one decent Soviet map, old Soviet map discovered, and the only other map in the world before this one was on the inside cover of Merle Feinsad's Smolensk Under Soviet Rule, which was a book that was absolutely foundational to modern Soviet studies and to US Russian Soviet studies. It was written in 1958, and according to my cartographer, was the best previous map. He was a famous Harvard Sovietologist, and he was the first one to work with the captured Smolensk Archive, with which I start my book. So the captured Smolensk Archive was the only Communist Party documents available during the Cold War outside of, in the West. And of course, Soviet archives were large, party archives were completely closed until the late 1980s. So the Germans had come in 1941. They discovered this, that the party papers had been left behind. And they started to work with them for propaganda purposes. They transported them to their sort of anti-Soviet study center in Poland. And they transported them west late in the war as to Vilnius first and then further west as the Soviets advanced towards Berlin, sometime around Auschwitz. No one knows quite how, but a portion of the Smolensk archive was separated. The Soviets recaptured the vast bulk of it and transported it back to Smolensk and Moscow. And something like 2% of the papers in this train were diverted and ended up first in Munich and then in Frankfurt, where there was a repatriation center. And they were supposed to be repatriated to the Soviet ally, but in fact, they were kind of stolen by the United States and poured over by intelligence agencies until the early 1950s. At that point, they were declassified and they were sent to Harvard to Merle Feinsod, who spent most of the 1950s poring over them and writing this foundational work. And by the way, I should say that when I worked a lot in the Feinsod papers at Harvard for this book, because Feinsod, you can see the subtitle of my work, Smolensk under Stalinist and Nazi rule, is kind of an homage to Merle Feinsod's work, Smolensk under Soviet rule. I got permission from Mary Feinsod Cousins, who is a professor emerita here at Cornell, professor of government. And she wrote me yesterday that she couldn't be here at this talk because she's traveling. But interestingly enough, when I was working in the Fein-Saud, I'll tell you this anecdote. I was looking in the Fein-Saud papers and writing a separate article about Merle Fein-Saud and how my work intersected and shed light on him, and I did a lot with his biography. And my son, who was a high school student at the time, came up to me and said, "Have you ever heard of Merle Fein-Saud?" And I said, "Have you hacked into my computer or something?" But it turned out that Fein-Saud's great grandson, so Professor Kapuscinski's grandson, was his best friend in high school, and had asked, when he heard that I was a Soviet historian, he asked if I'd ever heard of Merle Fein-Saud. So it's a small world. But in any case, the Smolensk archive that was captured and worked on by Fein-Saud, and then several generations of Soviet historians in this country, was fragmentary. It was about 2% of the total. And after 1991, when the archives opened and a lot of things were possible to study, generally historians thought that Smolensk, well, that's the one place we could have studied already, and they didn't go back there. There were some good works, a few, but compared to other areas and regions, there was not that much. And my idea for this book was to add the late 30s, because the Smolensk archive petered out in 1937. To add the rest of the pre-war Stalin period, and then to examine Smolensk under Nazi rule as well as Soviet rule. And those files really became embedded in my field of Soviet studies. So going back to Smolensk in a way was a kind of journey through the history of the field. But what I should say is that there were two regime changes, right, that I was able to study. 1941, when the Germans came in, and then late 43, when the Soviets came back and re-Sovietized this territory. And so two regime changes in a little over 3 years. This created a kind of laboratory for the historian of power and power relations. So to sum it up, this book was an attempt for me to write what I call an entangled history, instead of just studying Stalinism alone, or just studying World War II on the Eastern Front alone, or National Socialism and the occupied territories, or just studying the Holocaust alone. And those are three separate fields. I tried to put them all into the same book, into the same frame. I used German sources and Russian Soviet sources in almost every chapter, and tried to work on both sides throughout even the 1920s and 30s. And so each chapter kind of juxtaposes the German Nazi and Russian Soviet sides. Now, the reason that this giant Western oblast or region was created in 29 and dissolved in 37 was, as Stalin might have said, no accident, because that year, 1929, was the year of Stalin's consolidation of power, the Stalin Revolution, and 1937 was the year of the Great Terror. And so those were two major turning points in Soviet history and the history of Stalinism. And in 29, the head of the Western region became a man named Ivan Rumyantsev, an old Bolshevik party leader. And it was created, this reorganization of the territory created a huge opportunity for the Stalin regime in Smolensk to turn over its loyalists, to create a new party and state apparatus, to purge the old state apparatus, and to create a new network of loyalists. Rumyantsev was called by Merle Fein-Saud the first little Stalin. That was the phrase that Fein-Saud used. And now we probably call him a subnational dictator, if you want to use political science terminology. And in 37, he was purged, all his network was purged, his sort of that he had built up, and the whole region was demoted to this smaller territory. So in a way, Smolensk, which is far from Moscow in the sense that it was not part of the Moscow region, it was a largely rural region, far from the center of power, but it was also relatively proximate to Moscow in that today you could take a train from Moscow to Smolensk in 4 hours. Then it was longer, but it was still not like the furthest away. It was kind of like a playing ground for Stalinism to try things out. And I argue that in the Stalin Revolution and in the Great Terror, Smolensk was kind of one of the places, a testing ground for models of Stalinization that were carried out on an all-union level elsewhere. So I try to discard the simple dichotomy of center-periphery relations. And I show that scrambling the levels of power, what happened both in 29 and 37, was Stalin and Moscow at the center mobilized the lower echelons of power, the district level against the middle level, the regional level, to create a kind of foment and revolutionary kind of upheaval. And the playbook was quite similar both in the late 20s and the late 30s. So my book is about levels of power, local, district, regional, and central. When it comes to the German invasion, you can see this yellow part is actually that's, the small region of Smolensk, post-37 region that I studied. It wasn't important for the German occupational regime because the German occupational regime near the front lines had a whole band of territories from north to south that was run by the military administration, the Wehrmacht, as opposed to the Reich commissariats, which were essentially run by Nazi warlords, but they were in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics. So what you see in this map is the road to Moscow goes directly through Smolensk. And this route that you see from Minsk to Smolensk, through Vyazma to Moscow, this was exactly the road, the Minsk-Moscow highway that was built in 1936 by a Gulag forced labor under Stalin. It was actually a traveling forced labor camp that built this road. And, the German invasion went directly through Smolensk. And that's the reason that Army Group Center, which was after early days in the war, after late summer 41, was headquartered in Smolensk, boasted over 40% of the German divisions and over half the tanks because they were headed towards Moscow. And the sheer concentration of SS and Wehrmacht forces were also due to that reason. And so one thing I would say is that, the levels of power were important both between Berlin and Smolensk in the midst of World War II, but also that when you see most of the German soldiers were actually at the front lines, which stabilized in late 41 after the Germans failed to take Moscow. And so for over 2 years, the front lines were more basically stable, but the soldiers were concentrated at the front. So how do they manage this massive occupied territory, the sheer space of it, the size of it? There was over 40% of the pre-war Soviet population in occupied territories as a whole. They could not have done it without a lot of help from both armed and unarmed collaborators. My book kind of, unlike something like Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, which is kind of sweeping synthesis of Stalinism and Nazism, My book aims at the grassroots, at the place where sort of local and regional history meets the grand narrative. And Stalin and Hitler are still a presence, constant presence in my book, even though they never met the 10 or 12 main characters whose lives go throughout the book. And so the other element of the book, it's not just an entangled history, but I'm studying choice and agency and decision-making in this age of extremes. Like under extreme conditions, how do people navigate this change of regimes? How do they decide to become collaborators or to resist or to do nothing, which itself is a choice? And so that's what I try to get at through these lives of the main protagonists. And today, in this talk, I'm only going to be able to tell you about three very briefly of those cast of characters. The first one is seated at the desk, Boris Menshagin. He's the wartime mayor of Smolensk. He's surrounded by his civilian governance, which ran the city of Smolensk under occupation, and also by his Wehrmacht minder or handler. That's a portrait of Adolf Hitler. What's interesting is that Menshagin's activities under Stalinism, that is to say before 1941, bear an uncanny similarity to his activities under the German occupation. So in Smolensk in the 1930s, he was a lawyer who had become a defense attorney in some of the regional show trials during the Great Terror. And in the Stalinist system of jurisprudence, the defense attorney didn't actually defend the defendants. In fact, they became so zealous under the Great Terror that they often demanded more than the prosecutors, and which did not please the judicial authorities who want, because law and state administration were intertwined, and this was important for the Stalin regime to maintain the facade of having a legal system. And in fact, after the terror system was sort of rebalanced, and so in any case, he played an important role for the regime as a defense attorney. However, he did something quite unusual, which is that he stuck his neck out and he saved some of the defendants. He traveled to Moscow. This was a trumped up show trial of veterinarians who were accused of like infecting cattle with hostile capitalist, infection, something like that. It was a phantasmagorical scenario, like many of the show trials. But he simply called for more evidence. And in his memoirs, which are a whole story about how he received them, he kind of played up his resistance and courage, both as he did under the German occupation as well, more than the historical record that I found warrants. However, he did go to Moscow. We have records of this. He did talk to Vyshinsky, the main procurator. He did get those defendants' executions stayed, and he became a hero, a local famous person in Smolensk in the late 30s because of that unusual action during the Great Terror. And under the German occupation, he did much the same type of thing. In every respect, outwardly, he subordinated himself to the German authorities. He was, but behind the scenes, he saved some people, some Jewish people and some POWs. And he always thought of himself as more moral. He always remained an Orthodox Christian believer, by the way, and he got into trouble several times for that under the Soviets. And he thought of himself as more ethical than the venal, kind of corrupt collaborators or that he saw around him. So saving people gave him that sense of that he was superior, but he also, and this is my interpretation as rolled out, throughout the book, but he also received an honored position under both regimes and a slice of power for himself, especially when he looked not up to the German authorities, but downward towards the local population in a time of starvation and hardship. He had the power of life and death, over the civilian population in 1941 to 1943. So Menshagin illustrates a key phenomenon in my book that I call biographical logics. And let me explain it this way. Human decision-making is sort of explored in so many disciplines across human science. Economists study it, political scientists study it, neuroscience scientists study it. What do historians have to add? What can we add about decision-making? Well, I argue that what we do have is a sense of the entire life trajectory. So we can kind of figure out, especially when the record is thick enough, what the key turning points of someone's life is. And we also can contextualize those turning points. And so that's how I came to this study of people after years of work in the archives and the context. I often found little scraps and tidbits of material that when you looked at the lives, it actually had direct bearing on explaining some of those choices. So we can study the autobiographical texts, the lives as a whole, and then the contexts together. And that helps with people's self-presentations as well. So let me just say a few words about the memoirs that John wrote, because this was something that changed my project. I was giving a talk in Moscow, I think it was 2017, on Smolensk, and I got a note from someone saying, I can't be at your talk, but I have some information that might be of interest to you. And it turned out I've been working on this project since 2011. So I, of course, knew about Menshagin, but I didn't know that he had written these unpublished wartime memoirs that were the only major memoirs of a occupation era collaborationist mayor that kind of survived. And they had a strange story. So this book I was on the editorial team that put this out in 2019, and it's twice as long as this Crucibles of Power. It's like over 800 pages of text and annotation and essays. But what happened was that Menshagin had experienced the discovery of the Katyn massacre, which was carried out by Beria and Stalin against Polish officers in a huge thing in Polish-Soviet and Polish-Russian relations. They were captured in the partitions of Poland. Many of them were executed near Smolensk in a place called the Katyn Woods, which is about an hour, half an hour by car from Smolensk. I visited several times. Now there's a memorial both to the Polish and to the Soviet victims, because it was also an NKVD killing mass graveyard. But in the spring of 43, before the Germans left, this fall came and the mass graves were discovered. And the Germans made a big propaganda show about it, even though they were carrying out their own extermination camps at that time further west. But they brought in foreign journalists, and Menshagin was brought there. And then the Soviets, when they came back, they blamed it on the Germans, and it became a huge, it was at the Nuremberg trials, it was a big, well-known thing. And at the end of the war, Menshagin had evacuated with the Germans, but he ended up being captured by the Soviets near Prague and brought back to Moscow, where he spent years in the Lubyanka. And I guess, according to him, they didn't execute him immediately because no one wanted to make the decision. Maybe he could become useful in the future, as you have seen the Katyn massacre. His deputy mayor had already testified for the Soviets at Nuremberg and was sort of let off the hook and became a professor of chemistry in Novosibirsk. So maybe Menshagin would change his mind and bolster their version. We don't really know what was happening inside the Lubyanka. We only have Menshagin's version, but he wrote down memoirs and notebooks the entire 1950s and 60s. And in prison in the 60s, he met some dissidents who were especially interested about what he had to say about the Soviet legal system. So when he was released after 25 years in 1971, he went to a dacha outside Moscow. It was one of a dissident owned this dacha, and he had not been allowed to take his prison notebooks out, but he had a phenomenal memory. In this book, we discovered hundreds of cases where we could verify his dates and information with outside sources. But and I think that's part of his strategy in writing this memoir. In any case, I digress. The point is that he reconstructed the memoirs. They were smuggled out on tape to Germany, where they remained in an archive until they were published here. So past choices, to sum it up, bias future decisions, and he exemplifies how choices made under Stalinism kind of conditioned choices made under the German occupation regime. Let me briefly go through second person, Lucia or Lyudmila Mazyuk, who's the only extant photograph that I could find was from when she was a school child in the 1930s at this model school in Moscow. And as a young Komsomol member, she exemplifies the so-called 1930s generation, the people who never had experienced anything before the Soviet regime. And, so she took the exact opposite course that Shogin did. When Shogin became a collaborator, she eventually, almost single-handedly, founded the first underground communist cell in occupied Smolensk. In 41, she immediately volunteered to serve at the front. She couldn't get military training, so she got a quick training as a nurse. She was caught in encirclement, in the great encirclements that captured so many Soviet prisoners of war in 41 in the Smolensk region. And she there met another Komsomol woman named Asya Schneiderman, who's another figure in my book, who was Jewish. And everyone else was moving away from Asya to avoid the fact that she was Jewish they were captured by the Germans. But Lyudmila befriended her. They tried to escape several times back across the front lines, and they ended up in a POW camp near Smolensk, where remarkably Schneiderman was able to conceal her Jewish identity when young women and children were let out of those camps. They were given residency papers in occupied Smolensk city and were able to conduct these underground organizational endeavors without any help from Moscow. At that point, Smolensk was completely cut off. The city of Smolensk almost completely cut off. And it involved a lot of danger. A lot of their people got captured. She knew German. She was able to propagandize German soldiers in canteens where she worked. And remarkably, she even persuaded a couple of German soldiers to defect to the partisans. And she and this one German soldier named Leo, a former communist who had become a fascist, studied the second volume of Marx's Capital together in our occupied Smolensk. So this image of the Komsomolka and the Wehrmacht soldiers studying Marx in occupied Smolensk, to me, exemplifies some of the kind of unusual circumstances that could be found under the occupation. So what is, and also she in her autobiographical statements dealt with an almost taboo topic, but was very important for understanding the occupation, the relationships between women, Russian women, this was largely an ethnically Russian area, Smolensk, and German men, because most of the men were off on the Red Army, or they were either too young or too old to be in the Red Army, or they were at the partisans or fled. So the occupied population is largely female. And, many Germans married Russian women. They had children, which was a big issue after the war, but there was a ton of sexual violence and everything in between, sexual barter, coercion, and so on. So this is a whole chapter of my book, and Mazyuk offered some great some of the most interesting testimonies on this. But what does her case say about biographical logics? Well, she hated the fact that she had been studying to become an aviation engineer, but the Germans never believed that she could become a professional woman. They said condescendingly, yeah, you're very smart. In Germany, you could even become a secretary, because the fascist gender order was very different from the Soviets. Ideologically, it was one of the greatest divergences between the two ideologies. So after the war, Marzuk did achieve her dream and became not an aviation engineer, but an applied chemist. But she did so far from Moscow in the Komi Republic in the far north because her father had been repressed. So she and her brother, who's actually, he's the one holding the model airplane here, they ended up in the Komi Republic, where she became head of the chemistry department at the district energy directorate. So in other words, just like pre-war experiences could mold wartime choices, wartime experiences also shaped post-war trajectories. Lyudmila Marzuk died in 2002 at the age of 81. Now, the third case that I have, I don't have a picture of him because he was a peasant from a rural village, and he sort of but he was at one point placed in a prisoner of war camp, known in German as Dulags. This is downtown Smolensk, in the middle of the biggest square in the war. And his name was Vasily Maslenikov. So if Menshagin collaborated in complicated ways, and Marzuk joined the underground resistance, Maslenikov, the third person I'm going to end my talk with, was in between. He was cautious by nature. He was buffeted by events. His most precious asset was that he was literate as a peasant in a village near Smolensk in the 20s. He taught himself to read as a child. But the Soviet regime intervened in basic life choices, and his whole effort as a literate peasant to cobble together an education and escape the village, especially after the violent Stalinist collectivization campaign of the late 20s or 30s. He was desperate to escape the collective farm, but he never managed to really do so successfully. Took him like a decade, and the only way he could do so, in effect, was to join the party and to join the collectivizers. And that, by the end of the 30s, allowed him to finally get a job as a school teacher in a small town. Just as he got that position, the Germans invaded. So he was sent back to his home village, where he ended up spending most of the rest of his life in that same rural area. And his memoirs, which he wrote after the war over the course of several decades, trace the history of a single village. It's from the 1920s in the 1950s, huge kaleidoscope of changes. And to me, his life exemplifies the role of contingency, of chance, because first of all, he had two siblings who were also trying to get educations and escape the village, and they both all ended up in their village right in 1941. They went back to see their parents, but same siblings from the same family, from the same village, ended up on completely different sides in the political realm of things, because one of the brothers could not fight because of an injury and became a translator for the Germans, so he was going to collaborate. The sister was recruited by Smerch, which was the anti-insurgents, when they came back to purge the occupied territories and root out German spies and collaborators. So she was on the Soviet side, although she didn't like doing that. And Vasily was sort of caught in between. So in 41, when the Germans came, he had joined the Communist Party. We always had doubts about it. And he was known locally as a party member. So he was afraid what the Germans might do to him. So he allowed him, he was sort of recruited into the partisans, although he was reluctant to go, again, buffeted by events. And then he got captured, and he was in one of dulags, these POW camps. And this is just say, I'm nearing the end here of my talk, but I do want to say just a few words about this because these were essentially starvation camps in 1941 and the winter of 42. And in the course of the war, up to 3.3 million Soviet POWs were killed either by starvation, disease, mistreatment, or execution. This was, maybe 3 million, we don't know, figures of 3 to 3.3 million. If you compare the Holocaust on Soviet territory, according to Yitzhak Avad, who is sort of the main person in terms of statistics here, approximately 2.5 to 2.6 million Jewish victims were victims of the Holocaust on Soviet territory. We take the pre-1939 Soviet territory, 2.0 to 2.1 million. So the numbers of POWs who were victims was significantly higher. And however, there are hundreds of great books on the Holocaust in the East, on Soviet territory, written by some of the finest minds in the profession, but there's not a single monograph in English on the destruction of the POWs. All there is one German book written before the Soviet archives were opened, which is a great book, but still, there's nothing interpreted. And in my view, I have a chapter on synergies of violence. And this, that extremely violent regimes, genocidal regimes, if you want to call them that, or certainly the Nazis, didn't have just one victim group. They had multiple victims. POWs were actually associated with, with the concept of Judeo-Bolshevism, with communism. The Jews in those camps were filtered out first, among the first victims of the Holocaust. But more generally, when you look at all the waves of violence under the occupation, they're intertwined. The Holocaust, the POWs, the Scorched Village campaign, the anti-partisan war, and the sexual violence that I've read about, the rapes and other forms. They were all often carried out by the same perpetrators, and they come in, slightly different chronological sequences that are also interrelated historically. So in any case, the point is that this bears a lot more historical study, but in terms of Maslenikov, here I'm going to end my talk. At one point when he was captured from the partisans, he ended up in a POW camp near Slavl, which is a city south of Smolensk. So yeah. And he was offered a chance out of the camp, become an armed collaborator fighting the Poles. And he was offered good rations, he was offered good clothes, a uniform, and even a weapon. And everyone around him who was approached jumped at the chance. But he refused. He made a choice, despite the fact that he had been buffeted his whole life by events. At that moment, he made probably the most, fateful choice, which was to refuse. And in his memoirs, he wrote, I, of course, and this was published in a vanity press in Smolensk Region by his family in a print run of 200. So it's basically a primary source, but one of those copies ended up in the Library of Congress. I, of course, did not imagine myself to be a hero of the resistance, he wrote in a self-deprecating way. But something about serving the Germans repelled him. And he also realized that others might have volunteered to collaborate and then intended to escape later, but he observed that entailed great risk, and not everyone is capable of that. But he made his choice not only out of caution, something about the camp commandant's offer repulsed him, and his words convey a sense of bitterness at this servile role that he was, in fact, contemplating. As if it were not enough that I had ended up in captivity, now I was going to voluntarily serve them. So he said no. He was deported. He almost died in the camp, but ended up as a forced laborer in Saxony. And when the Red Army advanced, he was able to get back to Smolensk, ending up almost near where he was born. But because he had served the Germans as a forced laborer in the land of fascism, he was branded with a kind of stigma under the post-war Stalin, post-Stalin regime. So he was never able to really succeed in his life. And so that decision in the camp, in fact, probably ended up being the most faithful decision he ever made. Thank you.